Alright, and we are back with another AP US History video. It's been a little bit since I made one. You got to see the Scruggs from many years ago in those World War I videos. Now out in the great outdoors today, feeling good, rocking the North Carolina hat and the Lincoln shirt. What could be better, right? Talk about the Harding Presidency. Now I hope you watched the World War I videos. And coming out of World War I, you know that the United States was facing a lot of problems. Well, Harding's the guy that's going to tackle that. Harding's going to be elected in 1920 after he became the Republican Party candidate coming into the convention as a dark horse. You know, a dark horse is somebody that's not really expected to be the winner. All right, he's going to promise to take America back to normalcy. That's a term I need you to remember with Warren G. Harding, return to normalcy. So he's going to say we're going to take it back to the era before the progressive era, before the Great War was mixing and mashing up society. Harding was a news publisher. Harding had been a senator. Harding had also been the Ohio lieutenant governor. The Ohio governor during Harding's lieutenant governorship was a guy named Myron Herrick, who had angered some people with his stance on prohibition, and that's when Harding became the popular guy in Ohio. Now, Harding's got an interesting history because we know that he actually had several affairs. One was with a girl named Nan Britton, who Harding met when he was a newspaper publisher, and she was but a schoolgirl, and he actually did have a love child with her we know about. We know a lot about his affair with Carrie Fulton Phillips because we have their love letters. The family in 1964 gave those love letters to the Library of Congress with the intent that they be sealed for 50 years. They were. So in 2014, we started to learn that Warren G. Harding was a very passionate letter writer. We also learned that Warren Harding and his mistress had, not really a nice way to say this, they had nicknames for parts of his male genitalia. But we'll leave it at that. And if you want some dirty reading, just go search through the Library of Congress for Warren G. Harding's love letters. Now, there were some rumors. First off, she was his wife's best friend. Can't make Florence Harding too happy. But there were also rumors that perhaps she had been a German spy. One of the reasons for those rumors was because when he was a senator, she had frequently tried to get him to vote against U.S. intervention in World War I. There were also eventually rumors that maybe when Harding died in office that his wife had poisoned him as a result of learning about his affair with Carrie Fulton Phillips. Not very founded, but the rumors were out there. So after World War I, we've talked about there's a problem of arms control, getting every country to limit the number of weapons they have. There's a problem with European nations having all these war debts, and how are you going to rebuild these European nations that have been torn apart by war? So the first part of that, to break down the arms race, had Harding's Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, invite the major naval powers in the world to Washington, D.C. And they agreed that he tried to urge those countries, let me rephrase that, to build no more warships for 10 years. And the major naval powers are going to be the United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. Now, Japan wanted the ratio to be 10 ships for the U.S., 10 ships for Britain, and 7 for each of these others. And, of course, that ratio would be multiplied. The U.S. was hoping for 10, 10, 5s. What eventually was reached was 5 for the U.S., 5 for Great Britain, 3 for Japan, 1.7 for France, 1.7 for Italy. So what you should notice here is since Germany, even though they signed an armistice, was kind of the vanquished power, they're not on the list. And now Japan is also starting to become a military power. All right, in an effort to try to encourage countries to not wage war anymore, the Kellogg-Briand Pact encouraged countries to sign this and promise that they would not wage war as national policy. Essentially, it was a treaty saying that we'll only use war to defend ourselves. What's the problem there? Everybody thinks they're defending themselves in war. Nobody thinks they start a war, so there's no real means of enforcement. And remember, the League of Nations was created after World War I. That was a key aspect of the end of World War I. However, the United States did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States did not join into the League of Nations. So that's going to make it so the League of Nations lost a lot of credibility. Now, I mentioned war debt was a problem. There were massive resentment problems among European countries. Great Britain and France had borrowed massive amounts from the U.S. in the war. Great Britain and France were expecting to get money to pay this back, the reparations they were going to get from Germany. And then the United States also decided at this time to raise our import tax to the highest it ever been with a 40 encumber tariff. So that's going to slow down worldwide trade. So the world economic situation is not looking great at the start of the 20s. Now, this does protect U.S. businesses, but the problem is Great Britain and France can't send goods to the United States. If we're not going to buy goods from them, they're not going to buy goods from us. So, sorry for that cartoon. Germany decided to default on their payments. They eventually moved troops into the Rhineland as well. And this is going to look like we're setting ourselves up for World War II just a few years after World War I. So to the rescue is an American banker named Charles Dawes. Now please make sure you don't confuse this Dawes plan with the Dawes-Severalty Act that we talked about with Native American assimilation in Unit 6. Alright, so the plan for this Dawes plan was that the United States would loan money to Great Britain and France. So here we go. You got the U.S. U.S. giving that dough to Great Britain and France. Sorry. Confused y'all. Confused myself. U.S. gives money to Germany. Germany's going to use that money to pay their war reparations to Great Britain and France. Then Great Britain and France can now pay back the money they've borrowed from the United States. If you're saying, does that make sense because the money's flowing in a circle, you're right, it doesn't make sense. So what this isn't going to do is solve world economic problems. What it might do is relax some international tensions and put off war for a few more years. But essentially, the U.S. was being repaid with its own money through this plan. So causing a lot of resentment, Great Britain and France don't like the U.S. They consider us stingy and we didn't share in the cost of keeping world peace, they thought. We think they're being financially irresponsible. So now that's the mess that Harding is dealing with. His cabinet had three, I used to teach these guys as the three studs in his cabinet as being great cabinet members. I'm going to now just teach them as the three qualified cabinet members. I'm not sure how great they were. So the first of these guys we're going to look at, Charles Evans Hughes. You may remember we said that he was the progressive governor of New York in the progressive era. He then goes on to be a Supreme Court Associate Justice. He's going to run against Woodrow Wilson as the Republican candidate in the presidential election of 1916. He'll be appointed Secretary of State by Warren Harding. Then he's going to eventually become Supreme Court Chief Justice after Taft has health issues in 1930. So very interesting career. And as Secretary of State, he's the guy that's going to try to get these arms reduced with things like the Washington Naval Conference that we talked about just a few slides ago. All right, the second guy on the list there was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce during the Harding years. Hoover was well known for heading the Belgian relief effort during World War I. He saved so many Belgians from starvation that people started to say that he saved more people than any other man in history. Some people said that the phrase was that he saved as many or more than Jesus Christ. Of course, that was a joke, but it was basically saying that Hoover saved the Belgian people. He's an international hero. As head of the Foods Administration during World War I, the United States is now going to be able to triple their food shipments to the Allies. So essentially, the Allied war effort was built on the backs of Hoover's recovery plans. Now, Hoover was not that much of a generous guy when it came to going to see the Belgian people himself. He refused to visit the dirty Belgian refugee camps. Hoover also demanded that he have his face there anytime a newspaperman was there to take a picture of the relief efforts during the war. So very much a self-serving guy, but also great when it came to planning how to save the world. Now we'll go back and see Hoover come later in this PowerPoint and helping to clean up the Mississippi flood of 1927. And then we'll also see Hoover as the president from 1929 to 1933 when the Great Depression starts. Now the next guy was Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. Mellon we're going to see as a guy who greatly enriched himself through his time in the cabinet. He used the IRS to prepare his own income tax returns. We think that he used the IRS for some corrupt purposes. He used his own influence as Secretary of the Treasury to gain some foreign contracts for his own companies. And then by the time he finished his service as Secretary of the Treasury, we're going to see his wealth double. So certainly a man who is not afraid to enrich himself off of his government office. Now, what we're also going to see is that there was a meeting of American and European bankers in New York in 1923 to talk about European recovery. And one of the things that they planned to do was move some American gold deposits to Europe, basically allow them to be bought by European banks. And part of that was lowering U.S. interest rates. All right. And what you're going to do when you lower interest rates, it's going to make it so you have more people can get loans and invest in businesses. And Herbert Hoover very much disagreed with this. Well, Mellon didn't care. Mellon did anyway. And we're going to see that Hoover was the insightful guy here, because those lower interest rates kind of led to some out-of-control growth for the economy that we would pay for in the Great Depression. Now, Harding also had what we're going to call some duds in his cabinet who were not qualified. Harding had what was called the Ohio Gang as part of his cabinet. These were his poker playing buddies that he grew up with. And we're going to see that Harding wasn't necessarily corrupt, but he was willing to look the other way while his friends made themselves wealthy through graft. Remember, we talked about that word with Boss Tweed. And for the Ohio Gang, talk about a couple of things here. One interesting aspect of it was that a man named... And so Charles Forbes was eventually named head of the Veterans Bureau, and Harding didn't really know the man. Harding met the man for 1 week while both were vacationing in Hawaii at the same time. But to Harding, this was a level of trust that let him be put in control of one of the most lucrative departments in the government. So we think that by the time Charles Forbes was done serving as head of the Veterans Bureau, he eventually, through either corruption, graft, or malfeasance, or just plain incompetence, was responsible for missing about $200 million in federal funds. All right. The guy who was the fixer, who kind of did the dirty work for the Ohio Gang, was Jess Smith. He would control slush funds that could divert money in certain ways. He helped organize an H Street house in Washington, D.C., which is where basically the Ohio Gang would have their wild parties and kind of the center of this corrupt circle. There was a story of coming out of H Street house that there was a group of chorus line girls came through D.C. They were partying with the Ohio Gang fellows, and a girl was dancing on a table. And one man ended up getting drunk and throwing a plate and hitting a chorus girl in the head and killing her. So Jess Smith was the guy who gets this swept under the rug. Another very corrupt man during the Harding administration, who I'd like you to remember the name, is Attorney General Harry Daugherty. All right, so as I said, Harding wasn't necessarily always the corrupt guy, but often looked the other way or just did not pay attention to what was going on around him. What we're about to get to, the Teapot Dome scandal, which became the most well-known during the Harding years, was something he signed off on without really knowing what he was signing. You know, he didn't really read the fine print as he should have. So this Teapot Dome scandal involved his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, getting these oil-rich public lands moved from the Department of the Navy to the Department of the Interior. He then allowed private oil companies to come and lease out the lands and drill on them. So he later receives about $400,000 for this, and he's also going to be found guilty of bribery and becomes one of the first cabinet members to actually be sentenced to prison for his misdeeds in office. So recognize the Teapot Dome scandal. You can see with this cartoon, we've got that the oil scandal, driven by the big teapot back here, is running these politicians out of office. Now, Harding is going to die while he's in office, and that's going to lead... there's a lot of rumors about why he died, but anyway, that's also going to make it so he didn't really find out about all of the corruption in his administration and how much his reputation was going to be ruined because he died first. So I've talked about all this stuff about how Harding was, incompetent, or people around him incompetent. Let's talk about some things that maybe he did in a positive light. One was he did give Eugene Debs a pardon. You may remember Eugene Debs was a socialist guy who was the leader of the American Railway Union. He was jailed for violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts that you learned about in the World War I videos, saying that you could not say bad things about the government. Several people had tried to encourage Woodrow Wilson to free Eugene Debs because he was very old and sickly. Wilson refused. Harding did use his presidential authority to pardon him. He also fought hard for anti-lynching laws and to desegregate office buildings in D.C., so made some minor progress there with civil rights, remember, which was something most of the progressive presidents we talked about were unwilling to do. Now, Harding's sudden death catapults this guy to the White House. Calvin Coolidge becomes president after Harding dies. Now, Harding died traveling out west with his wife. He actually was planning a trip to Alaska, which his doctors encouraged him to cancel. We think now it's probably a heart attack or stroke. As I mentioned, there were a few rumors in a magazine article about 10 years later that maybe his wife had something to do with a poisoning. But Harding's dead, and now Calvin Coolidge is president. Now, Coolidge was actually going to become the only guy who ever takes the oath of office from his father. He was visiting family in Massachusetts, and he was where his parents lived. There weren't really any phones in the area, so it actually took a while for him to get word, because basically word had to be passed along to the closest phone in town. Somebody had to go wake up the Coolidge family. But he ends up taking the oath of office from his father, who was a justice of the peace, on the family Bible. Well, he's going to be elected in his own right, the election of 1924. And actually, you know what? Before we go too far, let's talk about another politician who's become a big name. Three-term governor of New York, eventual three-term governor of New York, FDR, was actually the Democratic vice presidential nominee in the election of 1920 when he lost to Coolidge and Harding. All right, so let's talk about why Coolidge. Why Coolidge on the Republican ticket in 1920. And Coolidge has gained fame as the Republican governor of Massachusetts. He put together a series of speeches that became a book called Have Faith in Massachusetts, and he becomes the law and order man. He had a great reputation, became somewhat of a national hero, because when the Boston police went on strike, he quickly called in the National Guard and kept order, which obviously you can imagine a police strike in a big city is going to be reason for mass chaos. So he becomes a guy who's got a reputation as making quick and very strong executive decisions. Now, he was also nicknamed Silent Cal. He was known as a man of few words. There was a story that at a party when he was president, there was a woman who bet a friend that she could get him to say more than 2 words. So she took a seat beside Coolidge at a table. She explained to him, "Hey, I made a bet that I could get you to say more than 2 words. He looks at her and he says, "You lose." All right, during Calvin Coolidge's administration, we saw the worst natural flood disaster in American history, the Great Mississippi Flood. You had a massive amount of Americans lost their homes. A lot of African Americans lost their homes in the Mississippi Delta in the New Orleans area. And it's going to be Herbert Hoover, who's still Secretary of Commerce, who's going to put together the relief effort here. Now, it did actually make Calvin Coolidge look a little callous, because Coolidge was asked to sign autograph pictures that could be auctioned off for flood relief, and he refused. Now, Hoover was able to put together a massive government, basically relief effort, and got Congress to spend millions of dollars to give to flood victims. We'll see it actually didn't amount to that much per person. We're going to see in a Kahoot game later in the week. But what this is going to do is show us 2 things. Now, one, this is going to be the start of a lot of African American families. I shouldn't say the start. That started in World War I. It's going to be the continuation of many African American families leaving the South, searching for new homes in the Great Migration. That's going to continue on to the 20s. So it's basically I guess you could say re-kickstarting the Great Migration from World War I. It's also going to show a lot of people that the federal government is going to have to get involved in some relief efforts in states, because this was too big of an effort to be handled by the states. So recognize those 2 changes. Now, I'm going to also very briefly dive into a second set of notes that I posted. It's called The Business of America, and I just want you to get an idea of what the government attitude towards business was during the Coolidge years, and basically it was very much laissez-faire. You can see this, y'all know that comes from the French term meaning hands off. Well, you can see with Coolidge's quote, "The chief business of the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there." He's essentially saying in the 1920s, money making was almost a religion to the American people, and Americans were all about the almighty dollar. So the government's all about free enterprise, letting businesses do their thing. And you can see this, there's a old Protestant hymn, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." Well, you can see here that the cash register now has become what was the organ, and these businessmen are singing "What a Friend We Have in Coolidge," implying that Coolidge is a friend of big business leaders. A couple other quick things. We'll come back to a 20s culture. The automobile is going to quickly change America during the 1920s. We're going to come into a little bit more detail there when we get to our 1920s culture notes. The automobiles are going to allow more opportunities for families to vacation. People can now live in suburbs, work in cities a little, get to work a little quicker. It's going to lead to booms in places like Detroit. That's going to get the nickname the Motor City. The airplane industry is going to take off in the 1920s. It's going to actually first be mail carrying, but by the 1930s, thought I had the statistic up there, it's actually safer to fly than it is to drive. Now, America is going to see our standard of living go up, certainly compared to the rest of the world, but we're still going to see there's going to be a vast number of Americans that don't participate in that new wealth. You can see the average income is going up from $522 to $705 by the late 1920s, and advertising is going to become a big industry. I'm not going to stop on each of these ads, but basically people need to be convinced to spend money that they had lying around now that people have a little bit more disposable income. I've always thought this ad was interesting, that more doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette. We're going to see athletes and doctors actually endorse cigarette brands, which obviously you wouldn't see today. It's a 1914 ad. There's a 1944 ad. I'm not going to talk long about those advertising techniques. We would if we were in class, but what I want you to note here is that as productivity increased, businesses expanded. We're going to see the first department stores like Woolworths, which is what that says, that's cut off. But we're going to see that there are, if you're a very well-tuned economist, some dark clouds on the horizon in the late 20s. While most businesses are growing, keep this in mind, the income gap between the workers and the bosses is going to grow as well. We're going to see that the iron and the railroad industries are really going to struggle. So not all aspects of society are going to participate in this economic boom of the 20s. And farmers are really struggling. And a lot of that goes back to World War I. You may remember that during World War I, Americans could produce as much as the whole world could consume. So farmers stopped practicing good crop rotation techniques. They had not let the soil replenish itself. Basically, they over-farmed. So we're going to see that's going to make it so in the 1920s we had a lot of farm surpluses, and it's also going to make it so in the 1930s the conditions are ripe for what we're going to see become the Midwestern Dust Bowl. All right, and a lot of Americans are making a lot of purchases on credit and installment plans, which were nicknamed a dollar down, a dollar forever. And a lot of Americans are just focused on having fun and living in the here and now. And it's kind of ironic because Calvin Coolidge preached you need to practice economy, that means save your money, and a frugal way of life. But the American people seem to throw care to the wind. And that's going to lead us down the road towards a depression that we'll get to soon. All right. Look at a couple of statistics from the Coolidge years. 1924, you had 75 Americans who paid taxes on incomes of more than $1 million. By 1927, you have 283 Americans in that tax bracket. So look at this. We are more than tripling the number of millionaires in the country just from 1924 to 1927. But like I said, everybody's not going to get to participate in that economic growth cycle. All right, we will be back soon with notes on the culture of the 1920s.